Okay, good afternoon, and welcome to our second meeting of the PSHRE Teachers Network. Today we're going to be focusing on lesson non-negotiables, and I will be presenting along with Mia. Louis, could you move the slide along, please? I presented last time. My name is Becs Hendry. I am the curriculum lead for relationship and sex education and health education at Bridgewater and Taunton College Trust down in Somerset. And I'm also a science teacher at Stanchester Academy. I do my role for PSHE 1 day a week. So I've had a really steep learning curve. I've been doing it for about 2.5 years. I've had a really steep learning curve into this, particularly as I did most of it during COVID, and so had to sort of meet my PSHE leads across the trust and things like that virtually. As a result, I would never profess to have all of the answers to every question. But what we're hoping to achieve with this network is some collaboration and some exchange of ideas and just sharing of best practice and things like that. So joining me today, I've got Mia. Mia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hiya, I'm Mia. I'm the PSHRE lead at Bridgewater Academy. So we're a technical school of agriculture. So I teach nothing but boys, would you believe? I'm also the personal development lead, the careers lead, a science teacher, and I'm the behaviour manager here. So it's a bit of a busy old place, lots of hats to wear. Been teaching PSHRE for about 15 years, but like Bex, wouldn't profess to have all the answers, just some of them, and hopefully between us we can answer most things.
Brilliant, thanks Mia. Louis, can we move along please? So what we're going to include today, basically 10 basic things that should be in every lesson. And whilst that's not something specific in terms of you must include this type of starter, it's just 10 things, 10 elements that should be present in every lesson, regardless of whether you're having a lesson that's all discussion based, whether it's, doesn't matter what topic it is, doesn't matter which key stage that you're aiming for. Okay, so this session should be applicable to key stage 1 right the way through to key stage 5. And it doesn't matter whether you've got lessons that you've written yourself or whether you've bought a curriculum in, or you've got an amalgamation of the two. These should be things that are always present, although they may take different formats depending on what your lesson looks like. Okay, Mia and I are going to flick-flack between the two of us, but we'll probably contribute to sort of each non-negotiable. Louis, can we move on please? Thanks.
So at this point, Bex has kind of passed over to me. And our first most important thing whenever we're going to talk about PSHRE is that it's a safe space. We talk about all sorts of things, which for some children can be quite triggering, can be quite frightening, and can just be quite distressing because some of our kids are quite sheltered, some of our little ones won't have heard this language before, and some may have experiences in life that we're not particularly aware of. So I always make sure that my students know they can step out. If required, they can step out, make it clear it's okay. If they need to step out, they may step out. That's absolutely fine. They don't need to ask. They can step away. Now that means you need a strong relationship with your kids and you can trust them not to just wander off. But also it does mean that they can get away if they start to feel trapped, which can be the case. I always have the information for our safeguarding team and appropriate sources of help available. In our case, they're on our knowledge organisers. So each subject area, the kids have got a knowledge organiser in their books. And so they've got the availability, how to get to Whisper, which is our anonymous reporting system, who to speak to in school, and various outside agencies, depending. You also will need a very good relationship with your own safeguarding team, because you are not going to know without their help who is going to be triggered by, sex ed, relationships ed, death and dying, and all of those kinds of things. Our safeguarding team have got our What We Teach When document on a pinboard in their office. and they keep an eye on it and will let me know if I need to modify or ask a child to step away, or in fact, you know, reschedule a child if necessary. So they are very, very good, but that only works if you've got a very good relationship with your safeguarding team. It might be that you need to go in, knock on the door and say, right, I'm talking about death and dying this week. I'm going to be doing it with year 7, anything I should know, and they should be able to let you know. Because dragging kids into something that's going to be triggering and unhappy will mean that you will break your relationship with them. The other thing you need to try and do, although I'm aware with curriculums and timing and everything else under the sun, is to try and make sure that the kids know the teacher reasonably well and know that it's safe. And if you're a teacher of one gender talking about sex, make sure you've got somebody of the other gender you can direct kids to if they're not happy talking to you. So obviously I teach all boys. Our science master is aware when I'm teaching those kinds of things that I will say to the fellas, if you don't want to talk to me, go and talk to Mr. Lyons, and that's fine. It just gives them a safe space to ask questions, and they might feel a bit uncomfortable with you if you happen to be a lady or a gent, depending on their preferences.
Okay, thank you, Mia. I think also with a safe space, we're talking about the kind of respect between the children within that group, and we're going to talk about ground rules in a couple of slides' time. But I think that's also key, that they have to feel safe within their peers to have that conversation, and obviously that takes time to build that trust, especially when you're sort of coming in from year 7 and you've got a good group of a good mixture of children. We have 11 core feeder schools into our secondary, and we have several others where we've got 1 or 2 students. So we have a huge number of children that just don't know each other. So obviously that really affects how we timetable, what topics we're timetabling in year 7, and when we're timetabling the ones where they really need to feel safe and comfortable to have those conversations. So we might timetable something like aspirations earlier on in the year, as those students are kind of getting to know each other, so that when we get to something about puberty or sex related, that actually they're more comfortable within their peer group to have those conversations. Thank you, Louis. Could you move on, please? So I have a big thing about PSHE being given the same level of gravitas, the same level of importance as every academic subject that we teach. And on a personal level, I actually feel that it's probably more important than the academic subjects, because we are looking at life skills. We're looking at how our students are going to grow up and face the world, and are they going to be resilient? Are they going to be respectful? Those kinds of things. And therefore, when you're planning your lessons, whether it's a bought-in curriculum or one that you've planned yourself, it needs to be in a recognizable format that kind of instills that level of, okay, this is a lesson, this is an important conversation, it's as important as my science lesson, etc. So for example, we've got a standard format at our school where every PSHE lesson is on the starter slide is recognizable that they're now in a PSHE lesson. Equally, we've also aligned it with how does every other academic lesson in our school start. So we have a silent starter in every single other, apart from PE, obviously, but we will have a silent starter where the children are doing some form of low stakes access, easily accessed sort of questions, or doing a quick mind map about something, but essentially every lesson starts with the same format. And then to make sure that our PSHE lessons align with that, and the students recognize that this is a lesson that they need to fully participate in, that our PSHRE lessons also start with that format as well. So we give them a starter task to do. Even if your entire lesson is then going to be completely discussion based, having that sort of standard format, an intro slide that kind of sets them off, it kind of brings them into that mindset that yes, we are in PSHRE. And for example, some of the bought-in curriculums, and there are others available, but using Jigsaw as an example for the primary curriculum particularly, they always start with a game. And then they have some calming and reflection time, and then they go on to the main crux of what they're going to be teaching in that topic. And so you talk to any student that has jigsaw lessons, they can tell you what the format of their lesson is, and therefore they always know it's a jigsaw lesson because of the standard way that the lesson has started and then continued. They get used to it, and students like consistency, they like predictability. You know, it reduces their cognitive load if they know what's going to happen and that they don't need to prepare themselves in a different way for something. So having a recognizable format definitely helps improve the kudos and the gravitas and the importance of that lesson within your school culture, but it also makes it predictable for the students to then follow. Mia, do you have anything else to add?
The other thing we do is we have recognizable books that are a different color from any other book, so that when they pick their book up, they know they're in PSHRE, and we use a consistent marking. So the way I mark and the way my staff mark, my colleagues that teach me mark, is exactly the same. We use the same stamps, we use the same coding, and we mark on the same basis, so that there's no sense that, well, I can do that for Miss and not that for Sir, or, you know, it's a recognizable format and a recognizable set of expectations, which does make life an awful lot easier.
Excellent. I think, yeah, I would add to that having somewhere to record the lesson, even if you only do a starter and then a little bit of a reflection at the end, having that information physically somewhere, then sort of also increases the kind of academic value of the lesson as well, because they're making notes. It's not just a scratty piece of paper that they can put in the recycling bin on the way out of the classroom. Okay, thank you. Louis, can we move on, please? Thank you. Mia.
So ground rules. Before we even start, we do this in year 7. Obviously, sometimes it can be a bit messed up with COVID, and it works best if you can get your boys, or girls, sorry, I would always say boys, to decide these for themselves. Now, we use the HODA curriculum, and there's a whole unit on setting ground rules in there, but you can make this up yourself. You can do it whatever way you need to. It really is important that these ground rules then get, we have one book that goes through from year 7 to when they leave, and the ground rules are stuck on the back page, inside back page. You will obviously need to guide them. They're 11. They're not necessarily fantastic at doing these things. Confidentiality is a rule, that if anybody says something in the classroom, you're not going to gossip it around so that everybody else on the planet knows, and not going on Facebook or TikTok or whatever. And that's really, really important. And at Brimore, we have to be a bit careful because we don't have a no phones rule. Our boys have got their phones in their pockets. So I also say that no phones out of pockets at all, so that nobody feels there's any risk of photos being taken or anything like that. Although that's actually something we don't see very much anyway. We also, I would discourage personal stories, and the whole, so what if I was sort of almost name dropping, but not quite kind of stories, just because those kinds of personal questions need to be kept personal, and that we need to continue to instill in our young people that their private lives are their private lives. And that's something that we see less and less of now, because they live their lives on Facebook and Instagram and whatever else they're using this week, and getting them to understand that they actually have the right to privacy and the right to tell their own story in their own way. So we avoid name dropping, and we avoid personal stories. Obviously, in PSHRE, we're not just talking about sex and relationships. We also do a lot of work on equality, and we might talk about religious faith, and we certainly will talk about sexuality. We have a set of words that we use for things. I don't allow improper words for body parts, but nor do I allow improper words for religious folk, or people of different sexualities. They want to talk about a homosexual man, they are expected to talk about a homosexual man. And they're also expected to understand that because of a range of religious views at school, some boys will disagree with others, and because of a range of moral views at school, some boys will disagree with others, and that's a good thing. So we have tolerance as a rule. We're trying to sneak that in. Usually it gets worded something like not being mean if someone disagrees with you, or something like that. Obviously listening, and hopefully that's happening in your classroom anyway, but we have a one hand up rule. I also have a no hands up rule. When someone's talking, everyone else must put their hands down, because we all know that when kids have got their hands up, all they're thinking about is the thing they're about to ask. So we insist then that the old hands go down, so that they are listening with, you know, whole body listening, which is quite difficult and particularly harder for the younger ones, obviously. And the one and only rule that I absolutely will not ever not balance on, if they don't put it in, I will have it, is be kind, because there's no need. There's never any need. I won't, you know, bullying, nastiness, calling people stupid names, no, not okay. And it's a subject where, as we're going to have safe space, the children need to feel that they're going to be kind to each other and they can express an opinion without being pounced on for having a different opinion to the bloke 3 chairs up. So those kind of ground rules are really, really important. And obviously, when we will talk about proper names for things a bit later in this, everything should have its proper agreed name, partly to avoid confusion, but again, partly to avoid anybody accidentally using an offensive term for something or someone and causing offence, because that's not okay. So yeah, anything I've missed, Bex?
I think you pretty much covered it, but I like the idea of the students coming up with their own set of ground rules with a little bit of support from the member of staff leading it, because actually they're more likely to buy into it if they've collaborated and it's their rules. And then you've got much more leverage when they break them, or if they break them. You can say, actually, these are rules that you set yourself. You know, they're not rules that have been imposed on you. You've set them yourself, and actually, you know, you need to honor the things that you've set yourself as well. Okay, thank you, Louis. I always think that it's a really good idea to establish a baseline. Whether you do that at the beginning of a topic or whether you do that at the beginning of each lesson, it depends largely on the topic. If you've got a topic with lots of discrete little subtopics, then you might want to choose to do this every lesson. But if you've got a topic that's kind of spiraling and you're adding to it each lesson, then maybe you're going to look at this, establishing this baseline at the beginning of the topic. And it has many benefits. Firstly and foremost, you're going to pique their interest. Okay, you're gonna you know, this is the topic that we're talking about. Actually, maybe you could ask them some questions about you know, facts associated with the age of consent, for example, and see if, you know, give them the ages of consents of random countries and see if, you know, they're true or false or something, just something a little bit random to pique their interest. But it's also really useful to assess what they already know, and particularly what language they might use around that subject. And we're going to talk about language again in a couple of slides time, but it's really, that's a good place to sort of start to gather information, like, you know, what words are they using for different body parts, what words are they using for different drugs, that kind of thing. And then you can sort of establish that sort of, what is their knowledge already, what do I need to learn because I've never heard that word used before. It also allows you to ID any misconceptions. So for example, you know, we've got here an example of a little alien with the bubble, what is consent? You know, that child might fill something in and have, you know, that it's black and white, yes or no. And then obviously that's a misconception that you can then address as the, you know, the course of the lesson or the course of that topic progresses. And it can take many forms. Some of these, hands up, I've taken from the PSHRE Association training that they ran on assessment. So I've taken some of those ideas from there and have used them quite successfully in a number of different topics. But things like multiple choice questions are really low stakes, easy access for children to kind of access, but they can also, as I say, pique interest because you can ask them really random things associated with the topic. The agree, disagree continuum, you can give them 4 questions or 4 statements and have agree and disagree as the sort of top right one there. And then they can just mark on it. They don't even need to sort of put a reason why, they can just mark on, do they definitely agree? Do they definitely disagree? Are they somewhere in the middle? Are they not sure, kind of thing. Mind map what you know, teach an alien, they're quite similar. You know, what do you know about consent? What does happiness mean to you? That kind of thing. Pose an open question. And another one that I particularly like, especially for younger children and if you're using it in a send context, is draw and write, because often children might not be able to express themselves, you know, in the written word, but might be able to draw what they understand different things to be. So what does healthy eating look like, kind of thing, and they can draw and write those, and then this baseline that you've got here can then be revisited at the end of the lesson, and you can see, you know, what have they learned during that lesson, how has their knowledge progressed, have they changed their opinion, etc. And you can do sort of a closing activity in maybe in a different coloured pen, so you can see where they were at the start to where they are at the end, how have they changed. Mia, anything to add?
We sometimes set our closing activity as a little homework, and we do 3, 2, 1. So, you know, what are the 3 things you remember from today's lesson? What are the 2 things you remember from last week's lesson? And what's your 1 question you still have?
Okay.
And you can set that as a really easy Google form or whatever on Teams. So if you want to make really quick, and then that gives you a whole set of questions as well on your, when you get your spreadsheet, you get your questions that they're still asking, and you can easily identify if there's a whole chunk of stuff that the kids literally have all gone, what? Because sometimes we don't teach terribly well and we miss things and things. So you get a whole question. If you get 10 kids ask the same question, you know you're going to need to recover it. And our boys are used to doing sort of really short preps after every lesson. So they would expect to get prep every lesson anyway. So that works well for us.
Okay, thanks, Mia. Okay, this is a key one for me. I think if we look back at our own, you know, relationship and sex education, PSHRE education that we may well have had, and I'm going back 30, oh my God, admitting that, going back sort of between 25 and 30 years when I would have had the main part of my sex education and relationship education before it was sort of formalized. And I remember an awful lot of, you know, don't do this, don't do that, this is really bad, you know, almost of kind of, you know, the negative things. And I think a lot of the topics that we now need to address are topics that we didn't address, or not necessarily that we didn't need to, but they weren't addressed when I was a child. But there's a lot of topics that we address that are very difficult. They are very tough topics for us to discuss with our young people. As Mia said earlier, some of those children may well have never experienced anything like it, have lived a very sheltered life, and all of a sudden you're sort of talking to them about something, you know, like mental health or suicide, you know, drugs and things like that. They may have lived a very sheltered life and know nothing about it. Equally, they may have had some real serious childhood trauma that's associated with those things. So it's absolutely imperative that your lesson starts on a positive. And that positive can take a number of different forms. It can take the form of you know, identifying when something has been very successful. So for example, you know, education has resulted in a massive drop in drink driving. And so actually that is a huge positive that students can take, you know, that, you know, very few people compared to 20, 30 years ago now drink and drive. And that, you know, that's a positive place to start. However, there is more work to be done, and we're going to talk about your choices, etc. Share case studies, for example, if we're talking about equality, then we look at Marcus Rashford, you know, appealing to the government and campaigning to the government to provide free school meals. And, you know, what a great role model he is for our young people. And start with things that are really, really positive before we get to the nitty-gritty, where we start exploring things that are not so positive, things that are sort of tough to process. And then when you're getting towards the end of the lesson, you should be then bringing it back full circle to end with a positive. And that could be something as simple as providing your students with a strategy for how they would manage that situation in a positive way. Where could they go? Who could they speak to? What choice of language could they have? You know, if they were met, you know, if we do a lesson on bullying, okay, so let's now practice actually what happens if somebody says something unkind to you. How do you respond positively to that to kind of minimize the impact on you, and what kind of language would you choose to use? Equally, it could be something like a case study of somebody who's maybe survived, you know, something like a young person that's, you know, recovering in remission from cancer, and, you know, a case study about their positive journey and how they've used, you know, their position for good, you know, in terms of things like fundraising or something like that. So always bring those difficult subjects back to a positive light. So when that child leaves the classroom, it's not all doom and gloom. They're not leaving and going to their English lesson with this really depressing note in their head, or this really depressing feeling about, actually, oh God, you know, this could be awful. They're leaving with a real positive, actually, yes, it could be awful, but actually I've seen the evidence of this person surviving and doing really well following on from this situation, or I know what I can do to make a difference, for example. Mia?
And also try to use positive language in general. It's very easy to do a whole lesson of don'ts, and they take all the fun out of stuff, and then they just ignore you because you're just the grumpy old woman that tells them not to do anything fun. And to get them to understand that when you're saying don't do drugs, it's not because you don't want to have any fun, but because they're unregulated and they're dangerous. You know, do things that you know are safe. Sex as well, we're very good at taking all the pleasure out of sex and making it all about the don'ts, and it's not allowed to be fun. And, you know, we need to use our positive language because we don't want to take all the pleasure out of their lives. We're trying to actually let them have fun safely rather than stop them having fun altogether. So when we talk about alcohol, yes, of course it's okay for you to occasionally go to a party and have a drink. I'm not telling you not to drink. But what I am telling you to do is remember that your body is made of what you put in it. And if you keep putting alcohol in it, your body's not going to make itself properly. You need to be more careful than that. And that makes much more sense. I think all the don'ts just make them, they'll switch out, it makes them tune out, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I second that. I'm actually thinking back to a topic, to a unit that I planned for my year 10s, and I taught it to my tutor group first as kind of a litmus test to see how it would go, and it was on healthy relationships. And there's some real tough things. We're talking about consent, you're talking about coercion, coercive behavior, coercive control, abuse, those kinds of things in that topic. But the first lesson I taught was about pleasure and about the fact that actually the whole point of a sexual relationship between two people is to be enjoyed. It's to be entered in mutually and to be enjoyed. And but actually that a lot of that starts with yourself. And so we then obviously then had this quite a large conversation about masturbation, and obviously that's something that's really important for you to be able to have a good relationship with those children. I wouldn't want to go in cold in a classroom with children that I didn't know and then have that conversation with them. But there was an avalanche. It basically started an avalanche, and by the time we got to the end of that topic, the questions and the realizations that had come from these 15-year-olds that I had known for 4 years, I think they saw me in a different light and I saw them in a different light. And you know, they suddenly realized that actually it isn't this bad, horrible thing that you're going to get pregnant or catch something and we shouldn't be doing it, and it's something that's dirty or something that's secret. You know, we've now got a very open dialogue about those kinds of things between myself and the tutees that I teach. So yeah, very definitely it play to the positives, but provide them with enough information that they can make an informed decision. Thank you, Louis. And leading on from that as well is simple, accurate language. So scientifically correct names for body parts and processes is absolutely key. So that everyone knows exactly what you're talking about. You're not kind of talking in rhythms and, you know, lady bits and front bum and, you know, funny little things that people call different parts of the body and different, you know, different activities and processes. That it's really important. And if you're not sure, ask your science department or ask your science lead in primary school, what words should I be using with my year 5s, etc. So that, you know, everybody's getting the same information. And it's a really good idea to make sure that you are up to date with the language that students are using, so that you you know, if they to drop the name of something into conversation, you're not sort of left, actually, I have no idea what you're talking about here. Are you talking about a drug? You know, what is it that you're talking about? And, you know, survey the students. You could do an anonymous survey. If you know you've got a drugs topic coming up, it would be really useful for you to know what are the current street names for those drugs. The website like Talk to Frank is actually a really good source. I've been on there today, I've had a look, and what we would have called weed or ganja, because that's how old I am, they're now calling pollen and bang and sinsemilla, which I've never ever heard before. There's, you know, there's obviously things like hash and skunk and things on there that we know. I actually was laughing with Mia earlier on because some of my year 9s caught me out because they were like, Miss, do you like blue cheese? And I'm like, yes, I like blue cheese. What a random thing to ask. Well, blue cheese is another word for spice. So they got me on that one and I missed it. So it's really important for things, especially drugs, sex and relationships, to kind of understand what language are they using to communicate about those topics. So yes, surveying the students is a really good idea. I would say maybe even just have a chat with 3 or 4, especially in secondary, because we don't tend to talk so much about drugs in primary school, whether they were more likely to know random names for things, street names. But yeah, have a chat with a few of your sort of more mature that you trust. What are the current names that people are using? We've got this topic coming up. I'd be really interested to know so that I can communicate with you guys in the language that you are speaking. For example, my 11-year-old came home from school about 8 weeks ago, and he was like, "Yeah, that's really chur, mum." And I was just like, "What does chur mean?" And he's like, "It's really good." I was like, I've never heard that word before, but he uses it all the time for something that means it's really good. So they have little slang terms for things, I suppose, as we did when we were younger. And it's really important to understand what those terms mean and whether they're positive or negative, whether they're code for things, that kind of thing. So it's also, and I've written down here in my notes, if you are uncomfortable using the word penis, using the word vagina, using the word sexual intercourse, oral sex, etc. If you are uncomfortable using those words, then you need to practice saying them. You need to put yourself in front of a mirror and repeat those words until you can say them without feeling a little bit uncomfortable. And if that also means that you need to also practice saying them to a colleague or a friend or somebody like that, so that you practice saying them out loud to another person, then that has to happen, because actually, if you are uncomfortable using those words with our young people, they will pick up on that, and they will maybe sense that maybe using the word, or I don't like the word for Miss is not comfortable using the word vagina because she screws her face up every time she says it. Maybe that's a bad word, or I'm not sure about that. So we need to be given very clear, positive messages that using the correct scientific terminology for your body and the correct term for processes is normal and is what you're going to accept in the classroom. Anything else, Mia?
And it applies to, it also applies to the language you use about one another, but in particular, they will come across words like clitoris and vulva that they don't necessarily come across in science. And certainly kids get the impression that the entire lady's genitalia is called a vagina, and you have to kind of explain it to them. So you do need to be comfortable, and you also need to be aware that they will try to catch you out with dodgy things, and you need to be going, and being really, really aware, because kids can be cheeky little what's-its, as we all know, and we will get caught out on occasion. And when we get caught out, it's worth putting your hands up and going, right, you got me. But it's also getting them to understand that we're not offended by any of their language, as long as it's not, racist or homophobic or whatever. And it's not that we're offended by the term willy or whatever, it's that we just want to make sure that everybody knows what we're talking about and there isn't any confusion. There's nothing wrong with their own words for things at all, because you don't want to imply that
sex, drugs and relationships have got any negatives, like, you know, you call your Willie, there's something wrong with you, you must be a bit strange. But we do want them to have a baseline with the language we're going to use to avoid confusion and to avoid a bit of embarrassment. And that makes it, you know, you say, I'm not just being a strange old lady, it's actually, I just don't want anyone getting confused, and that works better. I mean, they obviously, I'm 52, I'm a strange old lady anyway, so. I'm 40 years older than my students.
On that note, Louis, next slide, please. Okay, opportunities for discussion is an absolute key. There is no way that you can teach a PSHRE lesson and it's all chalk and talk or independent work. And there is definitely value in independent work and them processing what they've learned. But actually, PSHRE offers us this amazing opportunity to practice a skill that is vital for life, that's vital for their English GCSE, that's vital for if they do drama or history and geography, speaking a modern foreign language. Being able to have a discussion is a key skill. And as Mia alluded to earlier about children very often listen so that they can then answer and give their own opinion. And they're not necessarily listening to what's being said. Very often they listen to somebody speaking and they're waiting not to hear what they've said, they're waiting for them to stop speaking. So now it's my turn and I'm going to make my point, and they haven't listened, and possibly somebody else has already made that point or already asked that question and they've missed the answer because they were concentrating on the fact that I've got a point that I want to make. So PSHRE offers us this really, really amazing opportunity where every week they can practice having a conversation. They can practice listening to somebody else's point of view. They can practice actually really hearing what that person is saying and then taking a moment to formulate an answer to what that person has said, rather than them just firing comments at each other. And so there's lots of ways that you can do that and you can help that, but it's going to require some training of your students in how to do that. Now that might be that to start with, you're simply doing it in pairs, because actually having a group discussion and getting them all trained to sort of listen to everybody is quite a big thing, whereas you can get them to talk in pairs and give them a time. So partner A is going to talk for 30 seconds and then partner B is going to have 20 seconds to think about what they've said and then 30 seconds to respond, or something along the line. It doesn't matter what it is, but give them a framework to work within. Equally, you could give them something like a sentence starter, or when you get into the stage of group conversation, giving them a debate structure. So this person's going to make a point, and actually now once that person's made a point, you then have got a slide on the board that says, I agree because, or I disagree because, or moreover, I would like to add to such and such's point, and give them ways in which that they can then, introduce their points, agree, disagree, etc. And that is very definitely a skill that can be nurtured and massively improved in PSHRE. Another thing that we can also do, which is really brilliant, is regardless of what their opinion is, their own opinion is, if you're having a discussion, you can give them a character and say, actually, you might be completely pro-abortion, but this character is completely anti-abortion, and these are the reasons for, and now you have to argue the point using their opinion, and that allows them to helps them to see things from other people's perspective, other people's point of view, and forces them to look at a different opinion to theirs. I found that really, really effective when we're talking about things like IVF and abortion and things like that, where they have very, very strong held views, and also views that they may well have inherited from their parents, so they've been passed down, or equally really strong held views because of things that are in the media currently, that they just absorb that information and regurgitate it as if it's gospel, it's true because they read it on social media. So it's really good for helping them to challenge things that they read, things that they see, things that they hear, to get them to consider the alternative perspective. That's obviously not something that has to be in absolutely every PSHE lesson. Discussion has to be there, but you might want to consider occasionally adding in those students considering something from a different opinion to theirs as well. Mia?
And it's worth having a conversation with your RS department, because they are probably already using evaluation questions in their work, because they come up in the RS GCSE, the 8-mark and the 12-mark questions. So they should already have a structure, and it might be worth you buying into that structure if they've already using a specific one. They'll be slightly different depending on the exam board. And teach them to disagree respectfully. Well, I've got a sheet in our kids' books from another knowledge organizer, which basically has sentence starters for how to disagree. I like your opinion, but can I just add this? So that they've got a structure, particularly the littlest ones, the year 7s. I don't suppose our older boys refer back to it much at all, but the younger ones, they're not used to that whole conversation. To be fair, you know, just talking to another human being without your phone in your hand can be a bit of a challenge for some of our youngest ones. So we make sure they've got some structures of disagreeing respectfully, that they understand that you can have an alternative perspective, but you can't go, oh, you're talking a load of rubbish, that it's got to be done in a particular manner that's respectful and acceptable in polite society.
I think I have to say that one of the best discussion-based lessons I've ever seen was a year 5 class. And they had obviously been really well trained in the process. So the teacher then gave them a hand signal, and they all stood up. The tables were moved, the chairs were put in a circle around the classroom into sort of threes where they knew where they sat. And then they did their jigsaw starting game. I think they played On My Right or something like that. And then the discussion went for in their threes, and then somebody fed back to the class. And they had been very well trained. And I think if we can get that really well embedded in primary, that this is how you have a conversation, this is how you agree, disagree, then it carries forward and it makes it much easier for them to have those more difficult conversations when they're older. Because if you're trying to instill, this is how we have a conversation, this is how we debate, and you're giving them a really tough subject to debate as well, that is a double cognitive load. So instilling those opportunities for discussion with really simple topics to start with can often help as well. Practice the act of discussing. There's your cognitive load. You're practicing the act of discussing. Give them something really easy to talk about, like their hobbies. And then as you move further, then once they've got that habit, add in the cognitive load of a tougher subject for them to discuss, where they might have divided opinions and things like that. That could be, I mean, I'm thinking that actually discussion within PSHE could be a webinar in its own right next year. So, but we'll talk about that at the end.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Louis. Lack of catastrophe. Basically, as I alluded to before, our own experience of sex education, relationship education, drugs, etc., is very much like, don't do this, don't do that. If you do this, this bad thing is going to happen. And actually, somebody likened it to a roller coaster, because we all get on a roller coaster. We all know it's going to scare us. We all know we're going to feel those butterflies in our stomach, and actually, we might actually come off crying because it's frightened us so much, especially some of the big ones. But we still get on there. We still give it a go, because actually, it's a little bit frightening, but it's a little bit exciting and a little bit intriguing. So what you don't want to do is create that kind of environment where actually, Sir's told us all the bad things that could happen with drugs. But actually, you know, I'm intrigued. I'd actually like to find out for myself, kind of thing. What we can't do is stop them from making a mistake. We can't wrap them all up in cotton wool and then they never make a mistake of their own. But what we should be doing is arming them with completely informal, unemotional information that allows them to make their own decision. So as Mia said earlier about, you know, I would never say to a child that you shouldn't drink alcohol. But as a scientist, I might explain to them actually about the pressure you put on your liver when it's processing that alcohol, and things like that. Or I might, I might explain to them about the things that, you know, the outcomes of having unprotected sex are these. You know, at the end of the day, it's your decision whether you have sex or not and whether you use protection, but these are the potential outcomes, and therefore you have that information so that you can make an informed decision about what is best for you and your body. And so remove the catastrophe, and that links with starting and ending with a positive as well, and giving them good strategies. But yeah, don't give them that kind of roller coaster complex where they're really all of a sudden just very attracted to something that they've been told is really bad for them. Just make it, if you make it unemotional and just factual, they can take that time to then process that information themselves. And it also means that they're concentrating on what you're saying and taking that information in. So if they're then faced with a situation where they've got a decision whether they can either join in or abstain, you know, they're not being persuaded by the excitement factor. They've got at the back of the brain all of that sort of sensible information that they can then use to process whether they're going to join in or not. Anything else to add, Mia?
And I even take that down to the images and things that I use. So when we're talking about, for example, sexually transmitted infections, I don't use images. Some of the PowerPoints and things you find on sort of, you know, Times Ed resources or whatever, I've got lots of rather icky, unscary, very unpleasant images of sexually transmitted infections that have clearly been neglected for a very long time. And that kind of thing is not, you know, you're just adding something nasty, and again, it's off-putting. And you also want to really, really avoid making the bad things sound exciting. So it's quite easy to do, you know, to tell stories about things, or for them guys to let the kids go, oh, well, my dad did this, and let it become an excitement. Just to take that personal out of it. No personal stories. You know the deal. You know, this is what will happen to your body. This is what will happen to your finances. This is what will happen to your relationships. You know, these are your possible positives. These are your possible negatives. So that it just becomes a really settled, balanced, flat, almost a flat conversation. You take the roller coaster out and put it on a canal path.
Okay, thank you, Louis.
Anonymous questions are brilliant. They are much easier if you are a lucky human being and have your own classroom, which some of us will and some of us won't. I most definitely don't. So it's worth having a variety of ways that young people can ask questions. Post-it notes are brilliant, but what are you going to do with it? And sometimes that works. We have an anonymous question book that children can write in, that lives on a piece of string outside my office, and sometimes I get stupid questions and sometimes I get sensible ones. An anonymous questions box on your desk works reasonably well, but be aware that the boys and girls and young folk that you teach will look to see what people have written. My other problem with the anonymous questions box is it tends to exclude those young people that have literacy difficulties, find writing difficult, English is their additional language, all of those kinds of things, because they can't write their question fast enough to get it in the box unless you just don't have the time. So it is possible. One of the things we use is we have an open Google form that's set on our homework platform. We use Satchel 1, which the boys can get to, and they can send a question and it comes through to me anonymously on that form. So it's an anonymizing form. And that means they can do that at home in their own time and in their own space without being in view of other young people. And that works. And people say, what you do, and they can just say, I'm doing my own work, because what you can see on their device is Satchel 1, but they click through to a Google form. So that takes away that sense of being watched. Anonymous questions are also something we need to be very aware of if they raise a safeguarding issue. Is it okay for a 25-year-old man to be having sex with a 14-year-old? Should be raising a red flag in your mind, and you should be thinking, why is that question being asked? So it's really, really important you also, again, are ready to make sure the children know that questions might be anonymous, but that doesn't make them confidential, because you need to keep them safe. And it's because you care that you do that, not because you're prying or spying or gossiping. It's because you care.
Post-it notes are great. I find that I use post-it notes, and I actually, when kids ask a million random questions, I write them down on post-it notes and go, not today's topic, and put them separately. And then I might fish them out and in the next, when it's in the right topic, and they might go, oh yeah, I remember asking that. But anonymous questions are fabulous, and they really should be fitted into our classrooms, because some of the questions kids want to ask, they are just not going to ask. They're just not going to ask. And again, back to the position where they can ask a question without having to think about your gender or any of those kinds of things that, that can make a child feel uncomfortable talking to you. So I use a Google form, so I don't have a classroom. A box is great if you do have a classroom, if it's your tutor group. But it's finding something that works and is truly anonymous can be the hugest challenge of all, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we tend to use a Google form as on such a one, which is open.
Yeah, I think I would like to add to that one of the tips that I picked up from another PSHRE lead was that actually if you're using a proportion of your lesson for children to write down any questions that they still have about the topic, that you want them all to be writing at that point, so that every child feels like somebody's writing, like they're not the only person with just one question. And so what they do is they give out a sort of a piece of paper or post-it note, and on that they write, if they don't have a question, they simply just write, I don't have a question, miss, but thank you, or something along those lines, so that they've written something. And then all of the other people that do have questions are not there feeling like, oh, I'm the only one asking a question, because everyone else is sitting there not writing. So by the act of everybody writing, when they get folded up and put in the anonymous question box, they are totally anonymized, rather than, oh, only 4 people put questions in, so let's see what those questions say. Well, it was one of those 4 people that asked that question. It makes it even more anonymous to do it that way, if that's the way you choose. But I like the open Google form, and I know that at one of our other schools in the trust, they have got a section on their website that they can feedback about PSHRE as well, which they've been trialing this year. So that might be a way that we go across the trust for all of our schools. Thank you, Louis. And then finally, as we alluded to at the beginning, that our establishing a baseline, we can then go back and evaluate our learning during that lesson or during that topic. Equally, you can be looking at what you had at the beginning of the topic and where are you now at the end of the topic? Have you changed your opinion? Can we amend or add or remove anything to our mind map, to our questions? We were given an agony aunt letter to answer, and actually now, having done 4 lessons, I'm now thinking, actually, I wouldn't give that advice. I would give this advice, and this is my reason why, and I'm going to amend that. And that way you can also show some progress. It's a certain way of assessing how much that child has learnt during the lesson or the topic. Using things like 1 positive step forward. Actually, can you design your own strategy for how you would manage this situation? Microsoft Forms quizzes, which obviously you would be more likely to use as sort of evaluation and reflection as a home learning variation. But there are lots and lots and lots of different ways that you can evaluate and reflect, but it's really important that you revisit what you thought at the beginning of the lesson and how that lesson has impacted, or that topic has impacted on you as a learner, but also as the group together.
Yeah, we use some confidence trackers, so they have the statements at the beginning of a lesson, and they can mark whether they've moved forward or backwards on those, and those help. Apart from anything else, it encourages the young people to think that learning is important in PSHRE, that actually they should be changing their opinions, that changing their opinions is a good thing, that's a positive. And also, if you've got some means of tracking that, if it's in their books, if they've got notebooks or whatever, it does help when you get the dreaded Ofsted come and deep dive your personal development and want to know how the little darlings are doing, because it's very, very difficult to show progress in PSHRE. So of each lesson we can show at least changing opinions and changing ways of thinking, changing confidence, change of ideas, that we can at least show some progress, because it can be hugely challenging to show progress if we're inspected in PSHRE. It's not like science where you can test them at the beginning and test them at the end, unfortunately. So that evaluation, but the reflection thing is, evaluation is one thing, reflection is something else, and it's getting the young people to understand that pausing and thinking about what they think about a thing is really, really important, because for the rest of their lives, they need to learn to pause and think, because they're not just a body, they're not just a mind, they also are some form of whatever it is that keeps you alive. We call it psyche at Brimel, because we use the term psyche and soma, because they use soma in PE, because of soma types and what have you. So we use psyche and soma, and we talk about our psyche and how that's the thing that needs to be protected as well. And if we don't learn to reflect on our learning, it's not good for our psyche. It's important that we learn to be reflective people as well as being knowledgeable folks.
Brilliant, thank you. I just realised I forgot to say, I meant to say at the beginning that if you had questions, to drop them in the Q&A. So obviously now, if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask, I'll give you a minute or so to pop them into the Q&A. And while you're doing that, if you have any questions, the topic of our next webinar is going to be assessment. So, and again, it should be applicable for primary and secondary, and looking at ways that we can not necessarily test our students, but track their learning, track their understanding, and, you know, there are some schools of thought that maybe we don't need any formal sort of assessment in PSHE. How might we include it in a bought-in curriculum that doesn't already contain it? Are we going to assess in a single lesson, or are we going to assess across a topic across an entire year? So that's Tuesday the 28th of June from 4 till 5. And again, going forward for the 2022-2023 academic year, will be there'll be 6, there'll be 1 each half term, again, and I am very much looking for ideas as to what you would like to see. So the feedback questionnaire, which is in the chat, it's right at the top of the chat. There's a quick feedback survey there. It's a forms link where you can feedback. I'm gathering some sort of demographic information as to about where in the country you are, and what sort of things would you like to see going forward. I'm just looking through, so a couple of people, Dash, can't wait, just working on assessment sheets now. Do you have any ideas on how to do this with SEN non-verbal learners? That's a really good question, Lindsay, thank you. And I personally don't feel like I can do that question justice at the moment. Mia, do you think you could answer that question?
No, I absolutely couldn't, but my sister could. So let me answer it next time, because my
okay.
from working with non-verbal learners. So
okay,
hang on to that question. I can
hang on to that question. If you could possibly wait. Obviously, as I admit that, well, I'm not an expert in every environment, and I do have a colleague who works with SEN students who is going to present one of our webinars next year, specifically for PSHE with SEN students, and so there will be one of those, and hopefully it'll be probably one of the first 1 or 2 that we do next year, because I do feel like that's a really vital area that we need to look at. Okay, when it comes to how would you approach ending on a positive note when it comes to teaching topics like extremism and FGM? I'm a lead in a secondary school. Something like FGM, I would say we're looking at sort of the strategy. How do we look out for and protect our friends, our female relatives? You know, and look at the positive data, look at a case study perhaps of somebody who has been subject to FGM and now uses it as a platform to campaign for supporting other females from their culture or similar cultures that could be exposed to that or subject to it, and looking at like that. Equally as well with extremism as well, there are lots and lots and lots of case studies and videos and public speakers who have on the one hand been radicalized and but then have kind of gone through this process, and maybe they got caught, maybe they got sort of supported and captured early, or maybe they have had received some form of punishment for it, and actually whilst going through the process of that punishment they have been re-educated, and therefore this is now what they think these are the things to look out for. Because actually, again, also things like with drug addiction and things like that, there are lots of people who have used their experience as a platform to share with young people, so that they can receive information from people that have actually experienced that, and that there is a positive end to it, that that many people do enter into things like drug taking, and maybe have been sucked into some form of radicalization, but have actually managed to get themselves out and things like that. So perhaps looking for people in case studies, and there'll be lots of videos, or talking with your sort of local PCSO and things like that for people that might be willing to come and share their experience and how they're using it for a positive, those kinds of things. So yeah, all of those things would be a good way of ending those lessons. Okay, as Lindsay has put on about a really great documentary about girls from the same family experience FGM, and it led to one of them becoming an educator or campaigner. Mia's put on the FGM resource pack onto the chat, and the Ariana Grande concert, and the people who help, and the communities that come together after that act of terrorism. So that really great contributions. Thank you, Lindsay. So yes, if you could please look at that evaluation form and feedback, any ideas that you've got. And also, if you feel like you could offer something to this forum, like I say, I don't know everything, and I would never profess to do that, and I wouldn't feel comfortable talking on a topic that I wasn't experienced in. So if you do have a particular experience in assessment in PSHE, or SEND, or engaging vulnerable learners and the hardest to reach learners and things like that, it would be really great to hear from you. If you could pop that on your feedback form as well, that would, or email the PSHE Gmail account, which I think you will have received an email from that account when you booked. So yeah, if you could do that, that would be brilliant. Mia, anything else to add?
No, I don't think so. I think we're at the point where we've really started to, not only we've come to some answers today, but we've actually started to ask questions for the next one. So FGM stuff, there's a really good book that's worth talking about as well. I can't remember what it's called, which is what I didn't put it in the chat. But there are also a number of speakers that will come in and talk about FGM that have experienced it. So that's really good. So and extremism equally, if you're in a position where you can get your local imam or someone to come in and have a chat about the positives of faith and the positives of religion, so that we don't end up on a negative faith note as well, because you don't really want to make the idea that faith's not a great plan. Full disclosure, I am actually a vicar. No, I don't think so. I'm quite looking forward to the assessment one, because I think that's the one that challenges us all most. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, Mia. Great to see you. Thank you, Louis, for hosting. And thank you guys for attending. I hope it's been useful, and I'm really, really looking forward to having a look at your feedback. So thanks very much. See you next time.